Texas. Autumn 1886. Bragg laid his hand flat on the table, smile never touching his eyes. 5 minutes, Miss Ashford. Signed the ledger. Miriam didn't look at the paper. She looked straight at him. No, the room exploded. Then one quiet voice from the back corner. Which animal concerns you most? The man wore a mended coat and rode a borrowed horse. He looked like he slept in line camps. Bragg laughed. He owns nothing. Not 1 acre, not 1 cow. The man didn't laugh. He just looked at Miriam. That was the moment everything changed. Stay with me. The hall smelled like boot leather and tobacco, and men who believed their opinions were facts. Miriam Ashford stood near the examination table and did not move. Around her, the Red Bluff Cattle Association was running out of patience. She could feel it. The way the air in a closed room shifts when people have already decided and are only waiting for the body to fall. Cornelius Bragg stood at the front of the room with his silver watch chain and his careful smile. 5 minutes, Miss Ashford, he said. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. That ledger has been waiting 3 days. The Army supply contract cannot wait a fourth. 1,200 cattle. A contract worth enough money to buy half the county twice over. And Miriam's signature sitting between Bragg and all of it. She set her field journal on the table and opened it to the page she had already read 4 times that morning. 3 animals with elevated temperature, she said. One more showing labored breathing that does not match trail fatigue. The soil packed under several hooves came from a southern water ground, not from the route your drover declared. She paused, and I found old tick bites concentrated near the ears of 6 head, the same pattern I have seen before an outbreak. Someone laughed. Then 2 more men joined him. She's reading tea leaves, a man near the window called out. Bragg kept smiling. He clasped his hands in front of him. Miss Ashford, he said slowly, like he was explaining something to a child. Your father was a skilled inspector. Orrin Ashford knew this territory for 30 years. No one disputes that. He paused. But Orrin is gone, and what you are doing right now is something I have seen before. A grieving woman trying to hold on to her father's work by pretending she learned his gift, rather than simply observing it from a distance. The room shifted. Men nodded without deciding to nod. Miriam kept her eyes on Bragg. I can show you the temperature records, she said. I can show you the soil samples and the ear photographs. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to look at what I brought. Bragg let the silence sit for a moment. Then he pulled a folded paper from his coat. I am also asking you to consider your situation clearly. His voice stayed pleasant. Your boarding house bill in Red Bluff is 17 days past due. Your temporary inspection authority expires in... He checked the paper, though Miriam suspected he had memorized it days ago. 17 more days, after which no cattle association in Texas is legally required to honor your findings. He folded the paper and put it back. I am prepared to clear your debts today. All of them, in exchange for your signature on that ledger. Miriam picked up her pen. She capped it. She placed it back inside her coat. No, she said. The room erupted. Men talking over each other. Someone called her foolish. Someone called her something worse. A voice cut through it. Quiet but clear. Which animal? Miriam looked toward the sound. A man stood near the back wall. He was tall and lean, wearing a canvas coat that had been mended at both elbows. His boots were clean, but worn through at the toe seam. He held his hat in his hand, and there was nothing about him that suggested wealth or authority. He looked like a man who slept in line camps and ate whatever the cook had left. Which animal are you most concerned about? He asked Miriam. She studied him for 1 second. The roan steer, 3rd pen from the water trough, left rear hoof. He nodded and walked out. Bragg watched him go. The smile on Bragg's face did not waver, but something behind his eyes went still. The room waited. Nobody spoke for almost 3 minutes. The man came back inside. He walked to the examination table, picked up Miriam's journal, and read the entry she had marked. Then he set it down. She is right about the soil, he said. Southern water ground. High clay content. Dark mineral deposit. That animal did not walk the route on that certificate. He looked at Bragg. The hoof wear tells you how long and how the soil tells you where. Those two things together tell you the declared route is wrong. The silence that followed was different from the one before. Bragg looked at the man for a long moment. Then he looked at his clothing, his mended coat, his borrowed horse visible through the open door. "And who exactly are you?" Bragg asked. A cattleman near the center of the room laughed first. Then others followed. "He owns nothing," the man shouted. His voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who believes poverty is a moral failing. Not 1 acre, not 1 cow, not even the horse he rode into town. The laughter spread. The lean man in the mended coat waited for it to finish. Then he looked at Miriam. "My name is Bram Hollister. I can offer you paid work at Blackthorn Crown, inspector's wages, your own records under your own name." Bragg spoke before Miriam could. "Hollister." He said the name like he was putting something down that had gotten too heavy. "Your family's ranch." "Not my ranch," Bram said. "I will explain that when we get there." Miriam looked at him. She measured the steadiness in his face, the way he had examined the animal before he opened his mouth, the fact that he had confirmed her findings instead of dismissing them. She asked him one question. "If I go with you, am I free to leave?" Bram looked at her directly. "A locked door is not shelter." She picked up her field journal and her case. Bragg's voice followed her toward the door. Smooth and unbothered, the way still water is unbothered before it drops into a canyon. "You will come back," he said. "They all do." Miriam walked out into the dry autumn heat without answering him. They rode for over an hour. The land opened up around them, wide and brown under a sky that had forgotten how to make clouds. Miriam watched the country and said little. She was still running the figures in her head. 17 days of legal authority. An unpaid bill. A father 6 weeks in the ground. She noticed something around the 40-minute mark. A water station appeared on the left side of the trail. A man came out to check the trough levels and looked up when they passed. He saw Bram and touched the brim of his hat. Not the greeting you give a stranger. The greeting you give someone you know and respect and see regularly. Half a mile later, a fence crew working a broken section of wire stopped and watched them pass. One man raised a hand. Bram raised his back. A third group, further along, did the same. Miriam filed that away and said nothing. Then they came over a rise, and Blackthorn Crown spread out below them. She had heard the name. Everyone in the territory had heard the name. But hearing a name and seeing a thing are different animals entirely. The ranch was enormous. Not enormous the way wealthy men's properties are sometimes described out of flattery. Enormous the way geography is enormous, filling the ground from one horizon point to another, with grazing ranges rolling away in 3 directions and structures arranged in the center like a working town. Housing, a stable complex. Water tanks, windmills turning in the slow afternoon wind. A schoolhouse, a common kitchen building with smoke rising from 2 chimneys. Workers moved between the structures with the particular efficiency of people who know their jobs. A woman came out to meet them as they rode in. She was around 40, with strong hands and a foreman's bearing, and she addressed Bram without ceremony. "Council is waiting on the water report. Also, the North Quarantine needs another opinion." She looked at Miriam without expression. Then she looked back at Bram. "Chief Steward." Miriam heard those 2 words and went still. She looked at Bram, his mended coat, his borrowed horse, his worn-through boots. He had the decency not to look like he was enjoying her surprise. "Blackthorn Crown is the largest working ranch in Texas," he said. "It belongs to 5 trustees under a labor charter. Long-serving workers receive profit shares. The chief steward manages the ranch, but does not own it, cannot sell it, cannot mortgage it for personal gain." He paused. "I personally own none of it." Miriam thought about the men in that hall, the laughter. "He owns nothing." Said like it settled the question. Said like a man. Without private land was therefore without standing, without knowledge, without worth. She looked at the people moving through this place. She looked at the schoolhouse. "I want to see the quarantine pasture," she said, before anything else. Bram nodded and led her there. The quarantine pasture sat east of the main structures, separated by a double fence line. Miriam went through the gate and walked the herd in the fading afternoon light. She moved slowly and methodically, checking eyes, breathing patterns, ear condition, hoof wear. She found it near the back of the group. A calf, maybe 4 months old, mild fever in its ears, breathing slightly elevated, and cut into the soft skin of its left ear, so small she almost missed it. A crescent shape, deliberate, clean. Miriam crouched down and looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood up and opened her father's field journal. Her hands found the entry by feel. She had read it enough times that her fingers knew the page. She found the crescent mark in Oren's handwriting. Beside it, in his careful, cramped script, "If this mark appears at Blackthorn, someone inside has opened the road." The dry autumn wind moved through the fence posts. Miriam closed the journal and looked out at the largest ranch in Texas, with its schoolhouse and its windmills and its hundreds of people who had trusted someone who owned none of it. She thought about what her father had known. She thought about what he had not told her. The calf breathed slowly behind her in the fading light, and somewhere further south, something had already begun moving that she could not yet see. Miriam was up before dawn. She had slept 4 hours in a room with a clean cot and a window that latched properly, which was 4 hours more than she expected. The boarding house in Red Bluff had thin walls and a landlord who walked the hallway at midnight, checking for candlelight under doors. This room was quiet. That almost made it harder. She dressed in the dark, took her field journal, and went to find Bram Hollister. He was in the main building, at a long table, covered in route maps and ledger books, with a lantern burning low and a cup of coffee going cold beside his elbow. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised. Miriam set her written list on the table in front of him. "Before I begin work," she said, "I need an agreement." He pulled the paper toward him and read it. She watched his face while he did. He had a careful face, not closed exactly, but measured, the kind of face that had learned to think before it moved. The list had 6 items, her wages, stated clearly, to be paid weekly, her authority over all quarantine decisions within Blackthorn's borders, without requiring his prior approval, her right to inspect any Blackthorn cattle at any time, for any reason she judged sufficient, her right to leave the ranch whenever she chose, without penalty or debt attached to her departure, her right to keep her own records under her own name, and finally, her findings would never be submitted under Blackthorn's name without her written consent. Bram read it twice. Then he picked up a pen and signed at the bottom. He did not remove a single condition. Miriam took the paper back, folded it, and put it in her coat. "When do I start?" she asked. "You already did," he said. "The calf you found last night. I want to know how it got here." Maeve Callahan met them at the quarantine fence at first light with 3 senior foremen behind her, and an expression that made clear she had not yet decided what she thought of Miriam Ashford. "I have no objection to your agreement," Maeve said. She said it plainly, the way people do when they mean it, but also want you to understand it. "It's not the whole picture. What I do have is 32 experienced hands who have been working this land for a combined total of more than 300 years. They will not take direction from someone who has not shown them anything yet." Miriam nodded. "That was fair. Then let me show them something," she said. Maeve looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped aside. Miriam spent the next 2 hours working the quarantine herd in front of every foreman Maeve had assembled. She did not explain while she worked. She moved through the animals quietly and sorted them into 3 groups, using nothing but her hands, her eyes, and occasional close examination of hooves and ears. When she was done, she turned around. "That group," she said, pointing to the left pen, "has trail fatigue, rest, and water, and they will recover in 3 days. That group in the center has minor hoof splitting from dry ground. I would treat the cracks and rotate them off hard soil. The animals on the right need isolation and monitoring. 2 of them are showing early signs that concern me. One of the foremen crossed his arms. How can you tell the difference between trail fatigue and early sickness? They both look rough. Temperature, Miriam said. Breathing rate. Whether the eyes track movement normally, whether the animal is holding weight on all 4 legs equally. She paused, and hoof residue. An animal that has been standing in contaminated ground carries it in the cracks of the hoof wall, not always visible, but it leaves a particular mineral deposit when it dries. Contaminated how? I do not know the exact mechanism yet. What I know is that I have documented 7 separate outbreaks over the past 4 years, and every one of them followed a pattern. Animals from certain southern routes sharing water grounds with local cattle, specific insects present during the contact period, illness appearing in the local animals 2 to 3 weeks later. She looked at him steadily. I cannot give you a scientific law. I can give you the records. The foreman uncrossed his arms. He did not agree out loud, but he stopped arguing. Maeve watched all of this and said nothing. Tomas Ortega was 17 and trying very hard to be invisible. Miriam noticed him near the southern end of the quarantine fence during the morning inspection. He was doing small maintenance tasks with the focused attention of someone who is working harder than the task requires because he does not want to be spoken to. She walked over anyway. You work the quarantine rotation? She asked. Yes, ma'am. He kept his eyes on the fence post he was checking. How long? 6 weeks. Did you notice anything unusual on the southern fence line in the last 10 days? Any wires disturbed? Any gate hardware moved? His hand stopped. Just for a second. Then they started again. No, ma'am, he said. Miriam looked at the fence post. Then she looked at him. If something did happen and you were uncertain about reporting it, she said carefully, I want you to know that telling the truth later is still better than not telling it at all. Mistakes do not become smaller by being hidden. They become harder to correct. Tomas said nothing, but his jaw moved. She left him there and walked the southern fence line herself. It took her 20 minutes to find it. A 30-foot section where the wire tension was wrong, not cut, lifted and replaced. She could see where the staples had been pulled free and then driven back into slightly different positions. If you were walking past, you might not see it. If you were looking for it, the soil disturbance around the post bases made it plain. Someone had opened this fence from the outside, brought animals through, and closed it behind them. She went to find Bram. He came to look at it himself, and he brought Maeve. The 3 of them stood at the section of fence in the late morning sun, and Miriam showed them both exactly what she had found, and why the placement of the staples told her what it did. This was not cut because cutting leaves evidence that is immediate and obvious, she said. Lifting and replacing takes more time. It suggests someone who was not rushing, someone who had access to the right tools and knew this section of fence well enough to work it in the dark. Bram was quiet for a moment. Our fencing crew rotates sections. Not everyone knows every part of the south line. Then your pool of people is smaller than it seems, Miriam said. Maeve looked at Bram. Something passed between them that Miriam could not fully read. That afternoon, Bram announced that Blackthorn's northern shipping route would close until further notice. He said it at the evening meal in front of everyone. He did not soften it. The reaction was immediate. Workers asking about winter wages. Foremen calculating what closed contracts would cost. Families who had been counting on a full season's pay, now facing a shorter number. Miriam watched Bram stand at the front of that room and absorb every question without flinching. He told them the emergency reserve fund would cover basic wages while the route was closed. He told them that a disease scare that spread beyond Blackthorn's borders would cost every ranch in the territory far more than a closed route cost them now. He told them he would not pretend the decision was painless. Safety has a cost, he said. That cost should not fall entirely on the people who do the work. Nobody cheered. People rarely cheer for hard news delivered honestly. But the room settled. Miriam thought about that later, while she was writing up her findings by lamplight. She thought about the difference between a man who manages a situation and a man who owns it. Someone had searched her room while she was at supper. She knew because her field journal was facing the wrong direction on the table. She kept it spine-left always, a habit from years of working in wind where pages could blow. It was spine-right now, and 2 inches closer to the edge than she would have placed it. She checked her belongings carefully. The journal itself was intact. The folded employment agreement was still inside her coat, which she had worn to supper. Whoever had searched had found nothing useful. She sat down and kept writing. Tomas came to find her the next morning. She was at the clinic table, cataloging the temperature readings from the quarantine animals when he appeared in the doorway, with his hat in both hands. "I saw 3 riders," he said, 11 days ago. After midnight, I was checking the water tanks on the south end because one of them had been losing pressure, and I had not been able to figure out why during the day. He stopped, started again. One of them had a key, a blackthorn key, kind only senior foremen carry. He opened the south gate from the inside and held it while the other 2 brought 4 animals through. Miriam set down her pen. "Did you recognize any of them?" "The one with the key." Tomas hesitated. The way he walked. He had a hurt leg a couple years back, and it healed crooked. He walks with a particular lean on the right side. He swallowed. "I did not see his face, but I know that walk." "Who walks like that at Blackthorn?" Tomas turned his hat in his hands. "Mr. Price," he said quietly. "Alden Price." Miriam wrote the name down. "You did the right thing telling me," she said. "I know it did not feel easy." Tomas looked at the floor. "If I am wrong, and I have accused a senior foreman of something he did not do, then we will establish that through evidence," Miriam said. "You reported what you observed. That is all anyone can ask. What we do with it now requires more than one person's word." She looked at him directly. When a frightened young person is thrown away after one mistake, he does not learn honesty. He only learns to hide better. Tomas looked up. "Go back to your rotation," she said. "Do your work normally. If anyone asks you what we talked about, tell them I was asking about the water tank pressure problem." He nodded and left. Miriam sat for a moment with the name written in front of her, Alden Price, one of Blackthorn's most trusted foremen, a man who held a senior key. Someone inside the ranch had opened the road. Her father had known it was possible. He had written it down as a warning. She closed her journal and went to find Bram Hollister again. By mid-morning of the 3rd day, 4 of Blackthorn's senior foremen had formally requested Miriam's dismissal. They did it properly, in writing, submitted through Maeve to the Work Council. The petition said she was unqualified, that her methods were unproven, that her presence was disrupting established quarantine procedures, and that the ranch could not afford to operate on guesswork during a critical shipping season. Maeve brought the petition to Bram. Bram read it and then went to find Miriam. She was already in the quarantine pasture. "I know about the petition," she said without turning around. She was watching a roan steer near the water trough. "Let me show you something." Bram leaned against the fence rail and waited. Miriam pointed to the roan steer. "That animal will develop a visible fever before nightfall. Watch the breathing pattern. Watch how it is holding its back left leg. Watch the way its ears are tracking sound, which is slower than the animals around it." She turned to look at Bram. "I want the foreman who signed that petition here at 4 o'clock. Bram looked at the steer. Then he looked at her. "I will bring them," he said. They came with the particular body language of men who have already written the ending. Arms crossed, standing slightly back, expressions arranged to convey patient skepticism. The roan steer was worse by 3:30. By 4 o'clock, it was visibly ill, standing apart from the herd with elevated temperature and labored breathing, holding its back leg off the ground. Miriam had been documenting its condition every hour since morning. She had the notes in her journal, entry timed, describing the progression in clear, plain language that anyone could follow. She stood in front of the four foremen and showed them the journal without saying anything inflammatory. She let the entries speak. One of the men studied the journal for a long moment. "You said this morning it would develop fever," he said. "Yes, and it did. Yes." He handed the journal back. He did not apologize. He did not revise his position out loud, but he looked at the animal, and then at Miriam, with an expression that had shifted several degrees from where it started. The other three were slower. That was fine. Miriam had not expected speed. She had expected evidence to eventually do what arguments could not. Dr. Winifred Shaw arrived from Red Bluff that afternoon. She was 48, with silver-streaked hair pulled back efficiently, and the particular manner of a person who has spent decades being the smartest person in rooms that refused to admit it. She examined the quarantine animals with the same thoroughness Miriam used, though her methods were different. Where Miriam worked from field observation, Winifred worked from formal training. They arrived at the same conclusions by different roads. "Your pattern recognition is sound," Winifred told Miriam afterward. They were standing outside the clinic with the late afternoon sun coming in sideways. "I would not have structured the analysis the same way. But your findings are credible." "I know they are," Miriam said. Winifred looked at her with something that might have been amusement. "I am also here to confirm your legal authority. Bragg has been telling people in Red Bluff that your certification is invalid. It is not. Your temporary authority is real, properly registered, and remains in effect for 14 more days." She paused. "However, I want you to understand what that means for the Army contract. Bragg cannot complete it without you." "Because the seal alone is not enough," Miriam said. "The seal can support transit paperwork, temporary forms. A quick inspection at a way station might not catch the difference." Winifred's voice was precise and careful. "But the final Army contract requires your handwritten signature in the original inspection ledger. It requires continuity with your father's existing contract. And it requires my independent confirmation that the inspection took place." She looked at Miriam steadily. "Bragg needs your real signature, or he needs you alive long enough to absorb the blame for what he has already set in motion." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "He has already used my inspection number." "I believe so. Yes." The wind moved through the grass outside the fence line. "Then I need to find out where," Miriam said. Bram gave her access to the old blackthorn route maps that evening. He spread them on the long table in the main building and weighted the corners with books, and he did not hover while she worked. Miriam had her father's field journal open beside the maps. She had been working with Oren's notation system for 15 years, and she could read it the way other people read print. His abbreviations, his shorthand, his symbols. She had helped develop half of them. She worked for 2 hours while Bram sat at the other end of the table doing his own paperwork. The room was quiet except for the wind outside and the occasional sound of one of them turning a page. At some point, Bram brought coffee and set a cup at her elbow without saying anything. She drank it without looking up. Around 9 o'clock, she sat back. "The outbreaks follow a pattern that overlaps with Bragg's railroad shipping schedule," she said. "Not perfectly, but consistently enough. Disease scares appear in a region. Cattle prices in that area drop inside 2 weeks. And within a month, Bragg or someone connected to his association purchases distressed livestock or grazing rights at reduced prices." She tapped 3 points on the map. "Here, here, and here." All 3 times the price collapse was significant. All 3 times Bragg expanded his holdings immediately after. Bram studied the map. "Your father documented this?" "He documented the outbreaks. The route data and the purchase records are separate, but they fit together." She looked at Bram. "He spent years on these routes, these water stations, these symbols." She touched the journal. He was not simply observing disease patterns. He was building a case. Bram looked at the map for a long moment without speaking. "I taught Tomas something today," she said. How to record observations without adjusting them to match what a superior expects to see. She closed the journal. Evidence is only useful if it is written down honestly. The moment you change a record to please someone, you have destroyed its value. She was looking at the map when she said it. She was not looking at Bram, but she felt his silence change. The message from Isaiah came the following morning. It was delivered by a boy from the telegraph office in Red Bluff, folded and sealed, addressed to Miriam Ashford at Blackthorn Crown. The message was brief. Isaiah Boone, the telegraph operator, had something she needed to see. He would be at his office until 6. In the evening, she went. Bram rode with her, but did not ask what the message said. Isaiah Boone was 61 years old, with a careful economy of movement that came from decades of work in a space where every motion had to be precise. He had operated the Red Bluff Telegraph Office for 11 years. He knew things about this territory that the wealthy men who passed through his office never considered, because they had never thought seriously about who was on the other side of the wire. He led Miriam to a locked drawer and removed a folded telegram. This came through my office 8 months ago, he said. I kept a copy because the original was addressed to an army depot, and I had questions about it. It did not match anything in the routing records. He opened the telegram and set it on the counter. The sender was listed as O. Ashford. The recipient was B.H. Miriam read the message twice. It was 4 lines, her father describing a pattern he had confirmed. A water station, a route date, a contact point in the cattle records. The final line read, "If I die, Hollister must tell my daughter what both our families did." Miriam stood at Isaiah's counter for a long moment. Then she folded the telegram carefully and put it in her coat. She rode back to Blackthorn in the dark, with the message against her chest, and a question she already knew was going to be difficult. She found Bram in the main building, still at the long table, with his route records, and she set the telegram in front of him without preamble. He looked at it. She watched his face. He did not pretend he had never seen the name B.H. He did not pretend to be confused about what it meant. The stillness that moved across his expression was the stillness of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to arrive and is now looking at it. Miriam pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "What did my father believe your family owed mine?" she asked. Bram did not answer immediately. He picked up the telegram, read it the way a man reads something he has already read many times before, and set it back down. "My father helped Bragg build the cattle routing network," he said. "The system that allows shipments to move across the territory without full disclosure of origin points. The water stations, the relay camps, the informal agreements with certain railroad men." He paused. Alistair Hollister designed most of the infrastructure. Bragg provided the capital and the army connections. Miriam kept her eyes on him. "And my father." Orrin discovered what the network was being used for. "He came to me 3 years ago. He had already been gathering evidence for some time." Bram folded his hands on the table. "I believed him. I also believed he needed resources he did not have. Access to old Hollister route records, financial support for his travel, a secure channel for his findings." He looked at her directly. "I financed his investigation." The lamp between them burned steadily. "When he wrote that message," Miriam said, "he said you needed to tell me what both our families did." She let that sit for a moment. "You have told me what your family did. You have not told me what mine did." Bram was quiet. "You know," she said, "you have known for some time." "Yes, and you chose not to tell me." He did not look away. He also did not speak. Miriam stood up from the table. She was not shouting. She was something colder than shouting. "You decided what truth I was strong enough to hear," she said. "You sat across from me while I talked about my father's investigation and his records and his years of work, and you let me believe what I already believed because you thought protecting me from grief was more important than giving me the right to judge my own father." She picked up her journal. "That is not protection, Mr. Hollister. That is control dressed in a quieter coat." She went to her room. He did not follow. The Blackthorn Work Council met the next morning, Maeve had called it. She sat at the head of the table with the 5 trustees and 12 elected worker representatives, and she put the question plainly. Bram had information about the origin of the crisis affecting the ranch, and the council had the right to know what that information was. Bram told them about his father. He told them about the network, the route system, the informal railroad agreements, and Alistair Hollister's role in building the infrastructure that Bragg now used to move contaminated cattle without detection. He told them he had known for 3 years. He told them he had financed Orrin Ashford's investigation privately and quietly, without informing the council. When he finished, the room was silent for long enough that the wind outside became audible. One of the worker representatives asked why he had said nothing. I believed I could resolve the problem without exposing Blackthorn to legal risk, Bram said. That decision belonged to the council, not to me. I understand that now. Maeve looked at him steadily. You may carry pain for another person, she said, cannot carry their right to know. The council voted to open Alistair Hollister's private records. Bram did not argue. The map they found in those records led them south. It took most of the morning to understand what they were looking at. Alistair had kept meticulous records, but they were organized by a logic that reflected his priorities: shipping efficiency first, everything else arranged around it. There were coded markers for relay points, water stations, and what the records called temporary holding arrangements. Miriam worked through the code with Bram and Maeve and Tomas over 3 hours at the long table. She had her father's journal beside the Hollister records, and the two systems referenced each other in ways that confirmed both documents were authentic. Orrin had been reading these same records. He had made marginal notations that matched Alistair's coded markers precisely. One location appeared in both sets of records repeatedly: Salt Fork, an abandoned holding camp 12 miles south of Blackthorn's main boundary. They rode out that afternoon, Bram, Miriam, Maeve, and Tomas, with 4 additional riders positioned wide on the flanks. Salt Fork had been abandoned for years, but it had not been unused. Camp consisted of a collapsed structure and a series of holding pens along a dry creek bed. The pens were old but had been recently reinforced in several places. New wire alongside weathered posts, fresh-cut timber in the corner supports. They dismounted and walked the site. Miriam found the chemical residue first, dark staining on the soil near the largest pen, with a particular mineral smell she recognized from contaminated water grounds. She photographed it in her journal with careful written description. Bram found the animal remains in a shallow depression behind the east pen. Several carcasses, partially decomposed, with ear notching that had been partially obliterated. Tomas found the brand irons in the collapsed structure. 3 different irons, none of them blackthorns, stored together under a section of fallen roof timber. Miriam found pieces of her father's medical case near the water trough. A broken latch she recognized, stamped with a supplier's mark she had seen since childhood. A length of examination cord. A temperature gauge with a cracked face. She picked up the broken latch and held it. Orrin had been here. He had been close enough to gather evidence, and someone had known he was here. She put the latch in her coat pocket and kept working. The attack came from the tree line to the west. 4 riders, moving fast. Maeve's outer riders saw them coming and shouted a warning, but the terrain was wrong. A steep bank on the north side and dense brush to the east, and the warning came late. Miriam grabbed Tomas and pulled him behind the stone trough as the first shot hit the dirt 6 feet to their left. She had her hand on his arm and her eyes on the brush line, calculating angles. Stay low, she said. Move when I move. Bram and Maeve were already returning fire from the collapsed structure, using the timber as cover. The Blackthorn riders were attempting to flank left, but the brush was too dense on that side. A second shot. Closer. Tomas moved wrong, going right instead of staying down, and the third shot caught him across the upper arm. Not deep, but enough. He made a sound and grabbed it. Miriam pulled him flat and pressed her scarf against the wound with both hands. "Look at me," she said. "It is not deep. Keep pressure on it and do not let go. Do you understand?" He nodded, white-faced. The rain started then, not gradual. It came down all at once, the way storms come to flat country when they have been building for days. And within minutes, the dry creek bed was running. The bank behind the north pen began to give way, water moving fast and brown, carrying debris. Miriam looked at the rising water and looked at the terrain and made a calculation. "There is high ground to the southeast," she said to Tomas. "Old cattle path. Your weight is on your legs, not your arm. Can you move?" He said yes. She got him up and they moved. The route she found was not obvious. It was the kind of path that exists because cattle found it over many years, following natural drainage toward higher ground. She had seen the same pattern on dozens of other ranches. Animals moving water created trails that humans later used without understanding why the path was there. She got Tomas to the high ground. Then she went back for Bram. She found him at the edge of the flood line, helping one of the riders pull his horse out of the sucking mud at the creek bank. The attackers had retreated, either because of the rain or because they had accomplished what they came to do. Maeve had two of her riders pursuing them at a safe distance, noting direction without engaging. Miriam and Bram got the horse free. Then Rhett Danner appeared on the far bank. He was alone. He had not been one of the attackers. He was simply there, standing in the rain on the other side of the running water, looking at Miriam with an expression that was difficult to read at distance. Not hostile, something else. He raised his voice over the water and the rain. "Bragg does not need you dead," he called. "He needs you blamed." Then he turned his horse and rode south. Miriam stood in the rain and watched him go. Bram was beside her. She did not look at him. "He is telling me something," she said. "He is not telling me everything, but he is telling me something." They gathered the group and rode back toward Red Bluff. They found the telegraph office empty. Isaiah's chair was pushed back from the desk at a wrong angle. His spectacles were on the floor beside the counter. One lens cracked. The storage drawer where he kept the copy of Oren's telegram was open and ransacked. Every surface had been searched, quickly by someone who knew what they were looking for. Miriam stood in the center of the room and looked at the spectacles on the floor. Isaiah Boone was 61 years old and had been sitting in this chair long enough that the wood had worn smooth in the shape of him. He had kept a copy of a dangerous telegram for 8 months because he believed it mattered. He had trusted Miriam with it. She picked up his spectacles carefully. There was a note on the counter. It had been placed there deliberately, weighted with the telegraph key. She read it once. Then she read it again. "Bring the journal and the original ledger. Refuse, and the old man dies." Maeve came in behind her and read the note over her shoulder. The room was quiet except for the rain still hitting the window glass. Bram stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and water running off the brim, and when he read the note, his jaw went hard. Miriam set Isaiah's broken spectacles on the counter beside the note. She opened her field journal to a clean page. "The paper in this message," she said. "I need a lamp." She held the note to the light, the watermark pressed into the grain. "This is railroads into the grain," she said. "Standard supply paper. The particular weight and mark puts it at a maintenance station, not a commercial office. There are 3 abandoned maintenance stations within riding distance of Red Bluff." She looked at the note again. "One of them appeared in your father's records as a relay point." Bram watched her. "I know how to find Isaiah," she said. Miriam identified the station from the paper stock and confirmed it against Alistair Hollister's old route maps that night. The abandoned maintenance station sat at a rail junction 8 miles east of Red Bluff, where a secondary line branched south toward Army supply routes. It had been decommissioned 4 years ago, when the primary line was extended, and the official records listed it as unused. Oren's journal had a coded marker for it that matched one of Alistair's relay designations. She built the plan at the table with Bram and Maeve, while Tomas had his arm properly cleaned and wrapped by the clinic assistant. I will carry a false journal, she said. Similar binding, similar wear. The entries will look convincing at a distance, but contain nothing useful. She spread the map flat. Bram drives. Maeve's riders come in from the north, positioned far enough back that they are not visible from the station. Isaiah's assistant monitors the telegraph wire from Red Bluff. If any signal goes out that deviates from normal traffic, she sends word to the Army depot. She looked at Winifred, who had ridden out from Red Bluff when the news about Isaiah reached her. Can you file an official shipment delay notice tonight? I can have it submitted to the Army inspector before dawn, Winifred said. Then Bragg's contract is in jeopardy, regardless of what happens at the station. That limits his time. Miriam looked at Tomas. You stay at Blackthorn, watch the quarantine herd. If anyone attempts to move those animals before we return, send a rider to the Army depot directly. Tomas nodded. His arm was bandaged, and his color was better. One more thing, Miriam said. She looked at everyone at the table. Alden Price is not to know our approach route or our timeline. Maeve looked at Bram. Bram looked at the map. Agreed, he said. They left before sunrise. The storm had passed and the ground was wet and dark, which helped with sound. Bram drove the wagon. Miriam sat beside him on the bench, with the false journal in her lap and her real journal inside her coat. Behind them, in the wagon bed, were 2 empty supply crates and a canvas that could serve as cover if needed. They did not speak much on the road. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people focusing on the same thing from different angles. About 3 miles out, Bram said. I should have told you. Miriam looked at the road ahead. Yes, I told myself it would be more damaging for you to know than not to know. I told myself the investigation was better served by keeping the information contained. He paused. Those things were partially true. They were also partially convenient. Convenient for whom, she asked. He did not answer. He did not need to. The maintenance station appeared as they came around a long bend in the rail line. A low structure, weathered gray, with a water tank collapsed on one end and shuttered windows on the other. A supply wagon was parked behind it. 2 horses were tied at the east wall. They pulled up slowly. Rhett Danner came out of the front door. The plan began to fall apart within 20 minutes. Bragg's men came from the south and the northeast simultaneously, cutting off the angle where Maeve's support riders should have been approaching. Someone had given them the route, not just the primary approach, the secondary one too, the one they had only discussed inside Blackthorn's main building with the full group present. Alden Price had given Bragg both options. Bram saw the riders coming and got the wagon moving, but the northeastern group cut them off before they could reach open ground. Miriam kept the false journal visible and the real one inside her coat and said nothing that indicated. She understood. The plan had failed. They were separated from Maeve's riders and taken inside the station. The storm water had backed up in the drainage channel on the station's low side. While Bragg's men managed the situation outside, Bram found a lower room through a side door and went to check it for another exit. The water came in fast. He was chest deep before he found the room had no second door, and the water was still rising. Miriam heard him shout once, then nothing. She moved without thinking through it first. There was a rail winch mounted to the exterior wall, used for moving supply crates onto freight cars. The cable was still intact. She got the drum unlocked and fed the cable through the side door opening, called his name twice, until she heard him respond, and held the drum brake with both hands while he used the cable to pull himself hand over hand out of the rising water. He came out soaked and coughing and sat on the ground for a moment. She crouched beside him and checked his eyes, his breathing, his hands. Professional habit. The same thing she would do with any living creature that had nearly drowned. I am fine, he said. You will be, she said. In a few minutes he looked at her. She looked back. Then she stood up and went to find Isaiah. They found him in a locked supply room on the station's north end. He was sitting on a crate with his wrists bound and his replacement spectacles on crooked, and when the door opened, he looked up with the expression of a man who has been waiting with determined patience and is relieved but not surprised. Bram cut the rope at his wrists. Isaiah rubbed his hands together and straightened his spectacles. I was beginning to calculate the odds of that window being large enough, he said, looking at the small window near the ceiling. It would not have been, Miriam said. No, he agreed. I had arrived at the same conclusion. He had been listening to everything Bragg's men said through the wall. He had memorized the relevant portions. He told them what he knew. 8 years ago, Orrin Ashford had signed a false health certificate for one of Bragg's cattle shipments. Bragg had been paying for medicine. Miriam had been seriously ill, and the treatment was expensive. Bragg had threatened to stop payment and expose Orrin's accumulated debts unless Orrin provided the certification. The shipment had moved through a fever-affected area. The false certificate allowed it to pass inspection. Several weeks later, an outbreak destroyed the livestock of 4 small ranching families in the region. Those families never recovered financially. Orrin had spent the following years gathering evidence against Bragg. He had never told Miriam. The room was very quiet. Miriam sat down on the crate Isaiah had vacated. She held her father's journal in her hands without opening it. He used my being sick, she said. Bragg used my illness to control my father. Yes, Isaiah said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Bram. He was standing by the wall, with his wet coat dripping onto the floor, and his eyes on her face. And she could see in his expression that he had known this, all of it. He had known before she sat down in the station, before she found the telegram, before she arrived at Blackthorn Crown. You knew, she said. Yes, all of it, yes. She set the journal on the floor in front of her. Carefully, the way you set something down when you do not trust your hands to hold it steadily. You protected me from grieving the version of my father that I had, she said. You decided I was not strong enough to know that the man who taught me everything I know also did something that destroyed 4 families. Her voice was level, and in doing that, you took away my right to grieve, and my right to judge, and my right to choose whether I still wanted to do his work, knowing the truth of who he was. Bram said nothing for a moment. Then, you are right. I know I am. Isaiah looked at both of them and said nothing. He had spent 30 years being trusted with powerful men's words, while being denied equal standing in public spaces. He understood the shape of this conversation. He let it breathe. Then he said, there is something else you both need to understand. He decoded the shipment record from memory, reciting the details he had absorbed through the wall and cross-referencing them against what he knew of Bragg's railroad arrangements. The stolen seal could support temporary transit forms. A way station inspector doing a quick check might not catch the difference. But the final Army contract required Miriam's handwritten signature in the original ledger. It required Winifred's independent confirmation. It required continuity with Orrin's registered contract. Bragg still needed Miriam's real signature, or he needed her alive long enough to be blamed for the outbreak. And there was more. One of Bragg's falsely certified herds had already entered Blackthorn Crown. Isaiah had decoded a shipment record taken from Bragg's papers before his capture. The herd had moved through the southern wire opening that Tomas had reported. It had entered Blackthorn that morning. Miriam looked up from the floor. His plan, she said slowly. He does not just need me blamed. He needs the ranch quarantined. He needs Blackthorn's reputations destroyed. Then the regional cattle prices collapse, and he purchases distressed ranches and grazing rights at a fraction of their value. Yes, Isaiah said. That is what the records indicate. She stood up. The anger had moved somewhere different inside her now, past the personal part of it, into the part that thought clearly under pressure. I can love my father and still tell the truth about what he did, she said. Hiding his wrong would only continue it. She picked up her journal. A sound came from outside. Fast hooves on wet ground, moving toward the station. One of Maeve's riders had broken through the northeastern group and was coming hard. The rider pulled up at the door and called through the opening. The message was from Tomas. The falsely certified herd entered the ranch this morning. The first animals are already showing fever. Miriam closed her journal. She looked at Bram. He looked at her. On paper, she was the person who had approved that herd. Her inspection number, her temporary authority, signature forged on transit papers, carrying her father's stolen seal. She had not certified a single one of those animals. The paperwork said otherwise. We need to get back, she said. Nobody argued. They went out into the wet gray morning and rode hard for Blackthorn Crown. And behind them, the maintenance station sat empty at the rail junction where two lines split, one going north toward open country and one going south toward everything Bragg had built. The Red Bluff Cattleman's Register ran the story on page 1. Miriam read it standing at the main building's front window, still dusty from the ride back. The headline did not use her full name. It said Ashford Inspector in the kind of print that made a title sound like an accusation. The article stated that cattle certified under her inspection number had introduced disease into Blackthorn Crown, and that the Blackthorn quarantine system had failed to catch the contamination before it spread. It said nothing about forged transit papers. It said nothing about a stolen seal. She folded the paper and set it on the table. Bram came in behind her. He had read his copy already. She could tell by the set of his shoulders. The buyers, she said, 3 contracts suspended this morning. 2 more sent riders asking questions. He sat down. The work council meets at noon. She nodded and went to find Winifred. Winifred had arrived before dawn and gone straight to the quarantine. Animals. She had her examination notes spread across the clinic table when Miriam came in, and she looked up with the particular expression of a woman who has confirmed something she wished she had not. The transit signature is forged, she said. I compared it against your signed employment agreement and 2 other documents you produced at Blackthorn. The letter formation is wrong in 7 places. Whoever did it worked from a copied sample, not an original, but the seal held up. The seal is Oren's. It is real. A quick inspection would accept the papers. Winifred removed her spectacles and cleaned them. The combination is convincing enough that without direct comparison, most people would not question it. Miriam sat down on the clinic stool, which means Bragg has been planning this for long enough to obtain samples of my handwriting. Yes. Outside the window, 2 riders were crossing the yard at a trot. Workers going about necessary work while the ranch held itself together around them. She watched them cross and disappear around the stable corner. I need you to put your findings in writing, Miriam said. Your name, your credentials, your exact method of comparison. Every detail. Already started, Winifred said. The work council meeting was difficult. Bram stood at the front of the room and told the workers about his father. Not the abbreviated version he had given before. The full one, the route system, the informal railroad agreements. The way Alistair Hollister had built infrastructure that made it possible to move cattle without honest accounting of their origins. He told them he had known for 3 years. He told them he had financed Oren's investigation privately. When he finished, a woman near the back asked how long Blackthorn's emergency reserve would last if the suspended contracts were not restored. Bram gave her an honest number. Someone asked if they would lose housing. Bram said no. The charter protected worker housing. He would not touch that fund. Maeve listened to all of it without expression. Then she called for a procedural vote, and the council voted to restrict Bram's emergency decision-making authority until a full review could be completed. Any action costing more than a certain threshold required council approval. Any communication with outside legal parties required a trustee present. Bram did not argue. He accepted every restriction. Miriam watched him accept them. She thought about what it meant to lead something you did not own, to carry accountability without the protection that private wealth provides. When Alistair Hollister made bad decisions, the ranch absorbed the consequences, and Alistair kept his name and his standing. When Bram made bad decisions, the workers felt it first. That was the arrangement he had built. It was honest. It was also hard. Bragg's man found her that afternoon. He came to the front gate with a letter and a rider's manner, and he asked for Miriam Ashford by name. Maeve intercepted him before he reached the main building. But she brought the letter to Miriam unopened. Miriam read it at the clinic table. The letter was from Bragg. It was courteous in the way that a knife held at a careful angle can appear courteous. He offered her money. Enough to clear every debt, with a significant sum beyond that. He offered passage to New Orleans on a private car, employment with a livestock association there, properly credentialed, under a name of her choosing if she preferred, protection from any legal action regarding the disputed inspection. He wrote that he bore her no personal animosity. He wrote that she had simply inherited a difficult position through no fault of her own, and that the sensible resolution was to accept what was being offered. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller script, he had written, "Blackthorn cannot protect you from what is already recorded in the Army Ledger. I can." Bram came in while she was still reading. She handed him the letter without comment. He read it. Then he set it on the table. "You have the right to accept," he said. She looked at him. He was not saying it to test her. He meant it exactly as he said it. "I know I do," she said. She picked up the letter, went to the front of the main building where a dozen workers were eating supper, and read the relevant portions aloud. Then she set it on the table in front of them. "I am not staying because I owe Bram Hollister," she said. "I am staying because the people Bragg considers disposable have the same right to safety as the men who own the contracts." Nobody cheered. People do not cheer in moments like that. But she felt the room settle around the statement the way ground settles after rain, firmer than before. She went back to the clinic. The fire started around 9 o'clock. Tomas smelled it first and raised the alarm. By the time Bram and Maeve and Miriam reached the clinic building, the eastern wall was fully involved and the roof had begun to go. Miriam went in. She had the original temperature ledger in her hands and was back through the door in under 2 minutes. Bram caught her arm on the way out and pulled her clear of the falling roof section. Maeve had a water line organized from the nearest tank, but the structure was already lost. Tomas appeared at her elbow, with his good arm extended. He was holding Oren's brass bell, still attached to its worn leather cord. He had grabbed it from the clinic shelf on his way to sound the alarm. She took it from him and held it. They put the fire down before it spread to the adjacent building. The clinic itself was gone. Maeve walked the perimeter of the burned structure in the early morning dark. And she found the token near the east wall, half buried in ash and debris. A trustee token, the kind issued to senior representatives. She brought it to Bram with her jaw set hard. "Alden Price," she said. "His token number." Bram looked at it. Miriam took the token from him and turned it over in her hands. She held it to the lantern. The face was ash-darkened, as expected, but on the underside, where it had rested against the ground, one edge was clean. Not partially clean. Clean in a precise line, as if something had protected it from the smoke and ash right up until the moment it was placed. She showed Bram. "This was dropped after the fire was burning," she said. "Not before, not during. After." She set it on the fence rail between them. "Alton opened the southern trail, I believe that. But someone wants us focused on him right now." Bram looked at the token. Then he looked toward the south pasture. She followed his gaze. The quarantine gate was standing open. She knew before they got there. 2 lead steers missing. Monarch and the backup animal both gone, their halter lines cut clean. The remaining cattle were agitated, but contained. Someone had taken exactly the animals that a skilled drover would need to move a large herd in a specific direction. Miriam stood at the open gate in the dark, with ash still in her hair and Oren's bell in her hand, and she understood what Bragg was assembling. Not a disease scare, not just a quarantine, a stampede, and somewhere south of Blackthorn Crown. Thousands of cattle were already gathering near Salt Draw. They found Alden at a water station 4 miles south just after dawn. He was on foot. His horse had thrown a shoe in the dark and gone lame, and he had been walking back toward the ranch road when Maeve's riders came around the bend and stopped him. He did not run. He stood in the middle of the trail with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has made his calculations and arrived at surrender. Maeve brought him to the main building. Miriam sat in the corner and let Bram ask the questions. Alden told it plainly. He had opened the Southern Trail for Bragg's men 3 separate times over the past 6 weeks. He had done it because Bragg had been holding something over him for years, a specific thing, and had threatened to bring it forward if Alden refused to cooperate. When Bragg's pressure increased, after Miriam arrived at Blackthorn, Alden had gone further than he intended. He had passed along the approach route that Maeve's riders used during the station rescue attempt, both the primary and secondary routes, because Bragg had already known one and demanded the other. He had not set the clinic fire. He set it steadily, without drama. "What has Bragg been holding?" Bram asked. Alden looked at the table. "A man died on a cattle drive 8 years ago. One of the hands. We had been at it for 4 days without proper rest, and there was an argument. I struck him. He felt wrong." He stopped. Bram knew. "He helped me keep it quiet. Said the man's family would be taken care of, and there was no good that would come from a formal record of it." The room was very still. Miriam looked at Bram. His jaw was set, and he was looking at the table the same way Alden had been a moment ago. She thought about the list of things Bram had quietly absorbed: his brother's death on a forced drive, his father's system, Oren's false certificate, and now this. A man who fell wrong on a dark trail, and a decision to keep it buried because the immediate harm of truth seemed greater than the ongoing harm of silence. She thought about Tomas, 17 years old, and terrified to report what he had seen at the southern fence. She thought about what she had told him. When a frightened young person is thrown away after one mistake, he does not learn honesty. He only learns to hide better. She had believed that when she said it. She still believed it. But believing a principle does not make its application painless. "Get him something to eat," Miriam said to Maeve. "And water. We need what he knows about Bragg's assembly camp before we do anything else." Maeve looked at her, then at Bram. Then she nodded and took Alden to the kitchen. Miriam and Bram stood in the main building alone. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "The worker who died," she said. "His name was Clem Harveth," Bram said. "He had a wife and a daughter in Amarillo. I paid for the daughter's schooling through a discretionary fund. I told myself that was accountability." "That was money," Miriam said. "Accountability would have been a record." He looked at her. "You did it again," she said. "You decided what the truth was worth, and you paid what you thought was the equivalent price, and you called it settled. And Bragg found it and used it to reach Alden, and Alden opened the Southern Trail. And now Monarch is gone, and a man's death is still unrecorded, and his wife never knew what actually happened." She stopped. Then, quieter, "You did not protect people by keeping those things quiet. You protected your belief that you were the right person to decide." Bram was silent for a long time, then he said, "I know." He said it, the way a person says something, when they have finished arguing with it internally and lost. He told her about Oren then. All of it, in the order it happened. How Oren had come to him 3 years ago, with the beginning of his evidence, and asked for help. How Bram had agreed because he understood that his father's infrastructure had made Bragg's scheme possible. How Oren had asked, toward the end, that Bram watch over Miriam if anything happened. How Bram had come to Red Bluff the day of the Cattle Association meeting, not because of the contract dispute, but because Oren had been dead 6 weeks, and Bram had been watching to see if Bragg would move against her. Miriam listened to all of it. When he finished, she stood at the window for a moment, looking at the yard. Workers were moving between the water tanks and the stable complex. Normal work in an abnormal morning. You came to Red Bluff because my father asked you to, she said. That is why I came, Bram said. It is not why I stayed. She turned around. He was looking at her directly. No calculation in it. Just the plain thing. She crossed the room and kissed him, brief and deliberate. His hand came up to her arm, and she felt the warmth of it through her coat sleeve. Then she stepped back. That does not fix it, she said. I know, he said. I need you to understand that I am not a version of me that is easier to love because I do not know difficult things. I am the version who knows them and chooses to keep working anyway. That is who you are dealing with. I understand that now, he said. She believed him. She also understood that believing him was a beginning and not a conclusion. Alden came back from the kitchen with Maeve and told them where Bragg's assembly camp was located. A wide basin 12 miles south, accessible from the old Hollister Trail, with a natural funnel point at the northern end that directed moving cattle toward the Red Bluff rail yards. Miriam got the maps and laid the plan on the table. She would go into the camp, not alone and not recklessly. She would carry a false ledger and present herself as willing to negotiate. Maeve would bring riders in from the north, staying below the ridgeline. Bram would position a second group near Salt Draw and hold them ready. Isaiah, once they confirmed his location and safety, would watch the railroad telegraph from town. Winifred would take Bram's written statement about the forged papers to the Army inspector that morning. Thomas would stay at Blackthorn and keep the backup lead steer ready in case Monarch could not be recovered in time. Alden would give Bragg a false arrival window for the support riders. The problem none of them said out loud. Bragg had already forced Alden to give him both approach routes once. There was no certainty he would trust a third piece of information from Alden without verifying it another way. They went ahead anyway, because the alternative was waiting for Bragg to bring the herd north on his own schedule. Miriam saddled her horse herself. She tucked the false ledger into her bag and put the real journal inside her coat. She put Oren's bell in her coat pocket where she could reach it. Bram came to the stable door. Good intentions do not give a man the right to control another person's truth, he said. It sounded like something he had been working out for a while and had finally found the words for. I will say that to the council when this is over. Whatever they decide about my position, that is what I will tell them. She looked at him from the saddle. Then, tell them, she said, and mean it every day after. She rode out. The operation held for the first 2 hours. Miriam reached the Basin Road and followed it south, while Maeve's riders split into the northern approach, and Bram took his group wide toward Salt Draw. The morning was dry and clear, with a thin wind from the northwest that carried the smell of distant grass. Then Miriam's horse came back without her. Tomas saw it from the quarantine gate. The animal arrived at Blackthorn's front approach at a steady trot, saddle empty, reins trailing. He recognized the horse and recognized what it meant, and he ran for the main building. The rider Bram had left at Blackthorn found the message 15 minutes later. It had been scratched into the soft dirt of the South Trail, letters pressed deep by what looked like a boot heel. Do not charge the camp. The herd is already moving. Bram read it from horseback, then looked south toward the basin where a distant sound was beginning to build beneath the wind. Not thunder, the particular low percussion of thousands of hooves finding a direction and committing to it. He looked at Salt Draw. He looked at the trail. He made his decision and signaled his riders forward at a controlled pace, following Miriam's plan rather than his instinct, because she had asked him to trust her judgment, and he had said he would. Above the basin rim, smoke was beginning to rise. The supply wagon smelled like tallow and old rope. Miriam sat with her back against a crate and listened to the herd moving outside, thousands of hooves finding their rhythm on dry ground. They had not tied her hands too tightly. That was a mistake on their part. She worked at the knot while the wagon rolled and counted what she could see through the gap in the canvas. 3 outriders on the left, two on the right, the main body of the herd running alongside, and a head, held loosely, not yet pointed anywhere specific. Bragg was still deciding. That was useful. She had been watching the cattle since they loaded her into the wagon, and she had seen what she needed to see. The fever animals were positioned near the rear of the herd, behind the healthy stock. It was deliberate. If the animals were released all at once and driven hard, anyone trying to separate the contaminated ones afterward would have a near impossible job. Witnesses gone. Evidence destroyed. Red Bluff full of grief and confusion, and Bragg already aboard his supply train. That was the plan. She could read it as clearly as she read hoof residue. The wagon hit a rut, and she shifted with it. Her hands were almost free. Cornelius Bragg climbed onto the back of the wagon around mid-morning and sat on the opposite crate with his silver watch chain catching the light. He looked at her the way men look at a problem they believe they have already solved. "Miss Ashford," he said, "this has gone further than I intended." "Has it? I have always respected your father, whatever you may believe. You used his illness to threaten him into falsifying a health certificate," she said. "That destroyed 4 families. I know all of it now, Mr. Bragg. You do not need to manage what I know anymore." His expression did not change much, just a slight settling around the eyes. "Sign the ledger," he said. "This ends today and you walk away clean." She looked at him. No, he studied her for a moment. Then he climbed down without another word. The news from Isaiah's delayed message reached the Army depot sometime around noon. She knew, because the outriders started talking in lower voices after a messenger rode in hard from the north. Winifred had filed the challenge. The Army inspector was asking questions. Bragg's commercial plan was cracking at its seams, and she could feel the shift in the camp the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Rhett Danner appeared at the wagon gate that afternoon. He stood there with his hat pushed back, and his face carrying about 30 years of choices he could not undo. "You know what he is going to do," Miriam said. Rhett looked at the ground. "He'll release the herd during the fire, drive them north, destroy everything, and blame it on Blackthorn. And you," he looked up. "When investigators come through what's left," she said, "your name is on those contingency orders too, because Bragg made sure of it." She held his gaze. "You helped damage my father's wagon. I know that. You left him in that ravine." Rhett's jaw worked. "He was alive when we left." "That's the truth. Bragg is the one who stopped the search." "Then say that," she said, to a judge, to an Army inspector. "Say exactly that, and I will tell them you cooperated, my boy. We'll have a father who told the truth, instead of one who disappeared into prison, trying to protect a man who never intended to protect him back." The silence between them was long. "I'm not forgiven," Rhett said. "No," Miriam said. "You're not, but you can still be useful." She talked him through it, quietly and quickly. The lampblack was in a small tin near the supply crate. The axle grease was on the wagon wheel, housing. Together they would mark the contaminated animals so they could be identified and separated after the herd was contained. She showed him the crescent mark her father had documented and the ear configurations that matched the fever cattle, and Rhett looked at them and nodded. He had been working cattle all his life. He understood what she was pointing at. While he worked the near side of the herd, she worked the far side, moving low and quiet and fast, pressing the dark mark onto each animal she had identified. Her hands were black to the wrist before she was halfway through. She found Monarch near the front of the herd. He was standing apart from the unfamiliar cattle, ears tracking, not panicked but not settled. She put her hand on his neck, and he turned his head toward her. She found the bell in her coat pocket. The leather cord was still attached. She tied it loosely to his halter ring, not yet ringing it, just keeping it close. Then she went back to the wagon for the mirror fragment she had noticed in the supply crate that morning. The sun was angled right. She waited for a gap in the outrider's pattern and caught the light. 1 flash, 2, 3. She held the angle and counted. At Blackthorn, Bram was standing in front of the workers and the trustees, and saying everything he had kept quiet for years. She could not hear it, but she knew he was doing it, because she knew him. The way you come to know someone not through what they tell you, but through what they do, when the cost is real. She believed he was doing it. That was enough. Dry lightning cracked the sky to the south around 4 o'clock. The grass caught fast in the drought-dry ground. The smoke rose in a wide line, and the cattle nearest the fire began to move, slow at first, then faster as the smell hit them. She saw the lantern signal from the rail observation car. A brief coded blink. Bragg, giving the order he had already written down and handed to his field manager. The ropes were cut. The herd found its direction and committed to it, and it was moving toward Red Bluff. Miriam ran for Monarch and was almost there when the press of the herd caught the wagon broadside. The canvas went down. She went with it, hit the ground hard, and came up with one thought. Keep moving. Keep moving. She got to her feet. The smoke was thicker now. The cattle were all around her. Not a wall yet, but close. She was standing in the middle of it when Bram saw her from the ridge. She knew he saw her because she knew exactly where he would be positioned, which was where her plan had put him. She raised her hand once, open palm, stay. She picked up the bell and held it, and let the herd decide what happened next. The church bell in Red Bluff began ringing at 4:20. Winifred was already in the street. She had been watching the smoke build on the southern horizon for an hour and had organized the physicians and 2 of the town's steadier women into a loose emergency group. By the time the sound of the herd reached the edge of town, she had civilians moving away from the stock pens and toward the upper streets. At the telegraph office, Isaiah's assistant sent the emergency stop signal down the line to the rail yard. The supply train slowed. The engineer leaned out of the cab and saw what was coming from the south and stopped the train entirely, which put it across the bridge junction and kept the tracks blocked. Isaiah, freed and moving on a borrowed horse, reached the eastern road and made for the depot. Maeve's riders split at the draw. She did it with 2 short whistle signals, the kind her crew had been using for years, and the group divided cleanly. One section went left toward the top of Salt Draw and began clearing the old barrier. One section closed the western flank of the advancing cattle, keeping them from spreading toward the worker homes on the ranch's far border. The third group held the east. Bram kept his riders near the draw mouth. He did not charge south. He held position. He watched the smoke and the herd and the gap where Miriam was, and he held position because that was what she had asked him to do, and he had said he would do it. Miriam was on Monarch. She had gotten to him on her second try, coming up from his left side, talking low and steady the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old. Monarch knew her voice. He dropped his head, and she was up. The herd was loud around her. Not a stampede in full break yet, but close. The smoke was doing most of the driving, pressing from the south and east, and the natural terrain was doing the rest, funneling the cattle toward the gap that led to Red Bluff's rail yards. She guided Monarch sideways, cutting across the direction of movement, and rang the bell once. He raised his head. She rang it again, 2 short beats, the sequence her father had spent 3 months establishing with Monarch before he ever brought the animal near a drive. Monarch turned left. It was a small movement, a few degrees, but he was a lead steer with 300 miles of experience, and the cattle nearest him read it immediately. 2 animals followed, then 8, then a larger number, because a herd in motion will follow a lead animal sideways if the lead is confident and the terrain allows it, and there is nothing more frightening directly ahead. Tomas had released the backup lead steer from the Blackthorn side of the draw. The animal came in from the north, moving with familiar purpose, and when Monarch turned toward it, the gap between them became a direction. Maeve's group opened the draw. Controlled smoke from the dampened grass strips rose in a line along the town-facing edge of the herd. The cattle pressed away from it. Maeve's riders worked the western flank in close, using whistles and body position, keeping the edge tight. Bram's riders closed from the east. The mouth of Salt Draw was wide enough. Monarch went in. The second lead steer followed. The first 100 cattle behind them had no reason to do anything but continue moving, and Salt Draw gave them a direction. Then the far east edge broke. A section of 30 or 40 animals peeled off the main body and headed toward a gap in the fence line that Bragg's men had opened the previous night. Bram saw it and took 4 riders at a hard gallop to close it. His horse caught a rock wrong, stumbled, and went down at the fence corner. Bram came off clean and hit the ground running. He reached the gate on foot and got it closed, and 2 of his riders pushed the breakaway cattle back toward the main body. Tomas was at the side gate when the press of the herd hit the fence corner. He went down under it, not trampled, but knocked flat and pinned briefly against the post. Bram got to him in under a minute. He pulled Tomas clear with both hands, and Tomas came up coughing and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but moving. Bram lost his horse. He kept moving on foot because the work was not done. Miriam was still inside the herd. She had stayed with Monarch through the turn and into the draw, guiding him with her knees and the bell and the weight of her own direction. And she had been doing it for long enough that her arms were shaking, and the cut on her palm from a fence wire was open and bleeding. She ignored all of it. The draw was working. The terrain was working. The smoke was working. The majority of the herd was in the basin now, the natural walls of salt, draw holding them on 3 sides. The marked cattle, the fever animals. She had been watching them. They were in the basin, but to the left, away from the main press. She guided Monarch toward the right, and the separation held. The marked group moved into the shallow basin at the far end, where Rhett and 2 of Maeve's riders were waiting with rope lines. Then Rhett hit Bragg's field manager from behind. The man had been moving toward the rope lines to cut them, following his written orders even as everything else collapsed around him. Rhett took him down in the dirt and held him there and pulled the written contingency order from his coat pocket. He held it up toward Maeve's nearest rider. "Signed by Bragg," Rhett said, authorizing the release. The rider took it carefully. Bragg had not been in the field during any of this. He had been watching from the rail observation car, which was now stationary on the bridge approach because Isaiah's assistant had stopped the train. When the herd turned and the draw opened and the marshal's riders, who had been waiting in Red Bluff, began moving south with the Army inspector beside them, Bragg climbed down from the car and went to the bridge on foot. He was trying to reach the other side when the fire damage in the support timber let go. The section of bridge came down in sections. Bragg went with the first piece and landed on a wide beam above the dry creek bed, pinned by his coat and a fallen length of rail timber across his legs. Bram reached him in 8 minutes. The creek bed was not deep. The fall had not been fatal. Bragg was conscious and furious and bleeding from his left arm, and he looked at Bram with the expression of a man who still believed, even now, that something could be negotiated. Bram pulled the timber off him, lifted him, got him clear of the structure. Bragg said, "You need me." "You're going to trial," Bram said. "Saving your life doesn't erase your crimes. It ensures you remain alive to answer for them." The marshal arrived 2 minutes later. Red Bluff was loud with people and smoke, and the sound of the herd settling in the draw. Workers, townspeople, the Army inspector on horseback, Winifred organizing the injured at the edge of the stock pens, Isaiah dictating a telegraph message at a speed that suggested he had been composing it in his head for some time. Miriam found Bram at the edge of the creek bed. She was still on Monarch. Her coat was black from smoke and axle grease, and her hand was wrapped in a strip of her own sleeve. He looked up at her. "Where do you want me?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The smoke was clearing north. The draw was holding. The church bell had stopped. "Beside me," she said. "Never in front of me." He took Monarch's halter and walked with her toward the town. Behind them, the Blackthorn trustees called an emergency hearing for the following morning. The hearing room was packed. Workers from Blackthorn stood along both walls. Maeve sat at the head of the trustee table with the other 4 representatives. Bram stood in the open space in the center because he did not think he had earned the right to be comfortable. He told them everything. He had told most of it before, in pieces. This time he told it straight through, in the order it happened, without softening anything. His father's system, the Root Network, his private financing of Oren's investigation, and his decision not to tell the council. The death of Clem Harvath on a drive 8 years ago, and his choice to pay for the man's daughter's schooling instead of creating a record. The way he had known what Oren Ashford had done 8 years before Miriam ever arrived at Blackthorn. He said what he had told Maeve privately the night before. The charter means nothing if the people affected by my decisions don't have the right to judge me. The room was quiet when he finished. The trustees deliberated for 2 hours. They came back with a written determination. Bram had protected workers in the present crisis. He had built real safety reforms and maintained the labor charter through pressure from larger operators who wanted it dismantled. He had also concealed crimes and denied others access to truth they had a right to hold. He was not removed. He was not restored to full authority either. The charter was amended. 3-year steward terms going forward, with a mandatory review at 18 months. An independent complaint process, separate from any steward or foreman. Worker access to all safety reports. Trustee approval required for major emergency decisions once the immediate danger had passed. Equal pay for equal assigned work. Full legal representation for worker families in contract disputes. An independent medical and livestock inspection office, operating separately from the ranch's commercial contracts. Maeve became chair of the trustee council. She accepted without ceremony. Bram accepted every amendment. His re-election was divided. Enough people voted yes to keep him, but not by a margin that let him feel comfortable, which was probably right. He signed the new charter that afternoon at the long table, while Miriam watched from the doorway of the rebuilt clinic room. Cornelius Bragg went to trial 6 months later in Fort Worth. The case took 11 days. The evidence was substantial. Miriam's marked cattle, recovered intact from salt draw, confirmed the presence of the fever animals in Bragg's herd. The altered ear and brand marks matched the records from the Salt Fork camp. Isaiah's telegraph copies showed the shipment routing. Railroad schedules demonstrated the pattern Miriam had documented across 4 years of outbreaks. Oren's stolen seal was recovered from Bragg's papers. Winifred's analysis proved the transit signatures were forged. Rhett testified about the attack on Oren's wagon and Bragg's decision to stop the search. Alden testified about the blackmail arrangement and the Southern Trail access. The written contingency order signed by Bragg and recovered by Rhett was entered into evidence. 3 witnesses confirmed the lantern signal from the rail car. Bragg received 24 years. His commercial holdings were liquidated. The money went to the ranching families his disease scheme had destroyed, to the families of workers injured or killed on his drives, to the quarantine operations that would need years of funding to rebuild regional trust, and to the independent inspection office that Miriam had proposed in her written testimony to the Army. Rhett pleaded guilty to his part in the attack on Oren. His cooperation reduced the sentence. It did not eliminate it. He surrendered the back wages Bragg had been holding in his name as restitution and went to prison. When Miriam heard the sentence, she said what she had told him she would say. One right action does not erase every wrong. It may only mark the place where a man finally begins accepting responsibility. She meant it without cruelty. That was the hardest part of meaning it. Alden lost his position as foreman and his trustee seat. He was cleared of the clinic arson when the investigation confirmed the planted token. He was not cleared of opening the Southern Trail or concealing Clem Harvath's death. He worked restitution on a supervised arrangement for several years afterward. He never asked Clem Harvath's widow to forgive him, which was the one thing he did entirely right. The plaque above the new clinic entrance took Miriam 3 weeks to write. She went through 7 versions. The final one read, Orrin Ashford once acted from fear and caused harm. He spent the rest of his life trying to repair what he had done. This place honors neither perfection nor silence. It honors truth, responsibility, and the belief that a human being can choose to do better. The official record confirmed what Rhett's testimony had established. Orrin's wagon had been deliberately damaged. Bragg had prevented the rescue search. Orrin had died investigating the cattle network, and he had also, 8 years before that, signed a false certificate that destroyed 4 families. Both things were true. Miriam kept them both. She was offered a position in Austin, a proper government appointment, good wages, a credential that would travel. She did not say no to it. She negotiated. She became a regional traveling inspector. Her base was Blackthorn. She could inspect the ranch without Bram's approval, per their original agreement. Her records remained independent. The training clinic accepted students based on ability, gender, race, family wealth. None of it was an entry requirement. A limited number of students trained at no cost. Tomas was her first apprentice. He had a natural eye and terrible handwriting and a willingness to sit with sick animals for hours without complaint, which in Miriam's experience were the qualities that actually mattered. Winifred provided medical instruction, 2 days a week. Isaiah operated Blackthorn's independent telegraph station from a small building near the east gate. Bram found her in the clinic one evening, in late winter, after the last student had gone home and the lamps were burning low. He had something in his hand. He set it on the examination table in front of her. A key. Plain iron, recently cut. It's not a key to my house, he said. I don't own a house to give you. It's the key to the clinic supply room. The one they rebuilt with a new lock last month. He looked at it. You earned the right to build this place. You can keep the key, give it back, or change the lock. She picked it up. A home isn't a place where someone grants me permission to remain, she said. It's a place where my right to leave is respected, and I still choose to return. He told her he loved her. Direct. No lead-up. The way he said things when he had been thinking about them long enough that the preamble had worn away. She told him she loved him. Then she told him the conditions because she had decided this was the kind of thing you say out loud rather than assume. She would keep her name. She would keep her work. He would not speak for her professionally. She would not marry him to secure her position or anyone else's comfort. Neither of them would hide difficult truths to protect the other. He said, I don't want you to become part of anything I own. I want to become a man worthy of being chosen by you. She believed he meant it. That was new for her, believing something like that without waiting for the proof to accumulate first. 1 year later, working as equal partners through a hard summer drought and 2 outbreaks and a contentious contract dispute with a neighboring association, they became engaged. It was quiet, no audience. She said yes in the middle of a sentence about quarantine records, and he laughed, and that was mostly how it happened. The cattleman who had shouted in the Red Bluff Association Hall arrived at Blackthorn the following spring. With a sick herd and a look that said he knew, he had no standing to ask for help, but was asking anyway. He was surprised to find Bram in repaired clothes, working a fence line with 2 hands, no private cattle, no personal land, the same borrowed horse from the common remuda. He said something about it, not unkindly, but with confusion. He had assumed Bragg's fall had changed things, that Bram would have taken something back. Miriam came out of the clinic with a ledger under her arm and heard enough of it to understand. You were right, she told the man. Bram doesn't own Blackthorn. No one here owns another person's labor, future, or right to leave. That is why they trust him to lead it. The man stood with that for a while. Then he let her look at his cattle. Winter sunlight came through the clinic windows in the early morning and lay in flat strips across the examination table. Orrin's bell hung above the entrance on a clean leather cord, still and quiet. Miriam opened the doors to the first group of students, men and women, black and white, and Mexican-American, some from ranching families and some from worker camps, with nothing to their names but willingness. They filed in and found their places, and looked at her, waiting. Tomas was already at the table, with a clean ledger and a pen. Bram came to the doorway and stopped. Miriam saw him there. "You don't need permission to enter," she told him, "but thank you for remembering that the choice is mine." He stepped inside and stood beside her. Outside, Monarch moved through the winter grass toward the open draw, steady and unhurried, the herd spreading behind him across the wide blackthorn range. Nobody owned it. Hundreds of people worked it. The ground held them all. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, I think you already know it wasn't really about cattle, or contracts, or one crooked man trying to own a county. It was about something older and quieter than all of that. It was about what we do with the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Miriam Ashford stood in a room full of men who had already decided she didn't belong there. And she held her ground, not because she was fearless, but because she understood something most people spend a lifetime avoiding. Your integrity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you hand it over yourself. Bragg could threaten her debts, her reputation, her future. What he could not do was make her sign a document she knew was wrong. That choice, quiet, costly, and made without an audience cheering her on, is the kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It just looks like stubbornness. Most real courage does. Then there's Bram. Here is a man who inherited wealth, power, and a name that opened doors across the territory. And he looked at all of it and said, "This doesn't belong to me alone." He transferred the ranch into a trust. He surrendered private ownership. He kept wearing mended clothes and riding a borrowed horse, not as performance, but because he genuinely believed that a leader's life should cost him something real. And yet, Bram's deepest flaw wasn't his father's sins. It was his own quiet certainty that he knew which truths other people were strong enough to hear. He protected Miriam from grief and called it love. He concealed Alden's crime and called it mercy. He withheld Oren's wrongdoing and called it kindness. But protecting someone from the truth is not the same as respecting them. At some point, kindness becomes control, and the only difference is whether the other person ever had a choice. That is the line this story keeps returning to. Help becomes harm the moment it removes someone else's right to decide for themselves. And Oren, a father who made one terrible choice under impossible pressure, then spent the rest of his life trying to repair the damage without ever telling his daughter what he had done. We want our parents to be heroes. When they turn out to be human, the grief is different, heavier somehow, more complicated, because you have to hold the love and the disappointment in the same two hands at the same time. Miriam does that. She doesn't erase her father's wrong to protect his memory. She doesn't burn his memory down to prove she's honest. She keeps both things true, and she builds something real on top of them. That plaque above the clinic door is one of the most honest things anyone in this story says. It doesn't honor perfection. It honors the decision to keep trying. The world in this story is not fair. Men laugh at a woman who is right. A man with nothing is mocked by men with everything. Workers carry the cost of decisions made far above them. None of that is invented. All of it is still recognizable. But what this story insists quietly, without shouting, is that fairness is not something you wait to receive. It is something you practice, imperfectly, every day, in the choices no one is watching you make. Bram doesn't own Blackthorn. No single person does. And that, in the end, is exactly why hundreds of people trust him with it. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're coming back for the next one, I'll be here. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, ranches, events, and locations are entirely fictional and do not represent any real persons or historical incidents.